the light in her eyes. Sarah Mitchell had always known her son was different. While other toddlers babbled incessantly, 2-year-old Daniel spoke in careful, measured words, when he spoke at all. He preferred the company of his toy trains to other children, lining them up in perfect rows that no one was allowed to disturb. His tantrums weren't typical childhood meltdowns. They were overwhelming storms that seemed to consume his entire small body. The pediatrician's office smelled of antiseptic and anxiety the day they received the diagnosis. Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but clinical as she explained. Autism spectrum disorder. Daniel shows the classic signs: delayed social communication, restricted interests, sensory sensitivities. Sarah's husband, Mike, gripped her hand as the words washed over them like a cold wave. "What does this mean for his future?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every child is unique. With proper support, therapy, and understanding, many children with autism lead fulfilling lives." That night, after Mike had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Sarah stood in Daniel's doorway watching her 3-year-old son arrange his trains by color, then by size, then by some mysterious system only he understood. His dark hair caught the hallway light, and his intense concentration reminded her so much of her own father, an engineer who had seen the world in patterns and systems. "We'll figure this out together, baby," she whispered into the darkness. The months that followed were a whirlwind of appointments: speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioral interventions. Their modest suburban home in Columbus, Ohio, became a revolving door of specialists, each with their own theories and approaches. Daniel thrived on routine. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., he would eat his breakfast, always the same: 2 pieces of toast cut diagonally, orange juice in his blue cup, and 3 strawberries arranged in a triangle on his plate. Any deviation from this routine could spiral into a meltdown that lasted hours. Sarah learned to see the world through Daniel's eyes. The grocery store wasn't just a place to buy food. It was an assault of fluorescent lights, competing sounds, and overwhelming smells. The playground wasn't fun. It was unpredictable chaos, where children moved in ways Daniel couldn't anticipate or understand. She became his interpreter and his shield. When the neighbor kids stared at Daniel's stimming behaviors, his gentle hand flapping when he was excited or overwhelmed, Sarah would calmly explain, "Daniel's brain works differently. This helps him feel better." Mike struggled more with the adjustment. A contractor who valued straightforward problems with clear solutions, he found himself frustrated by Daniel's needs. "Why can't he just try harder to be normal?" he asked one evening after a particularly difficult day. "Because normal doesn't exist," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "There's just Daniel, and Daniel is perfect exactly as he is." The marriage began to strain under the pressure. Mike worked longer hours, and Sarah felt increasingly isolated, carrying the weight of Daniel's care mostly alone. When Daniel turned 5, something magical happened. He discovered music. It started with the old piano in their living room, a wedding gift from Sarah's grandmother that had sat mostly unused for years. Daniel was drawn to it like a moth to flame, pressing keys and listening intently to each note. Within weeks, he was picking out melodies by ear. Within months, he was playing complex pieces that Sarah had to look up on YouTube to identify. His musical ability wasn't learned in the traditional sense. It seemed to emerge from somewhere deep within him, a language he had always known but never had a voice to express. "He's gifted," said Mrs. Patterson, the music therapist they eventually found. "Truly gifted. I've never seen anything like it." Daniel's first recital was in the community center, a small affair with folding chairs and a slightly out-of-tune upright piano. As her son walked onto the makeshift stage, Sarah's heart pounded with anxiety. Would he be overwhelmed by the lights, the audience, the unfamiliarity of it all? Daniel sat at the bench, adjusted his posture in the precise way he did everything, and began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune.
The room fell completely silent. Even the restless toddlers seemed transfixed. The music that flowed from Daniel's small hands was transcendent. It wasn't just technically perfect, it was emotionally pure, untainted by self-consciousness or performance anxiety. He played with his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly with the melody, completely absorbed in his own world. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for a heartbeat before erupting into applause. Sarah wiped away tears she didn't realize had fallen, and for the first time since the diagnosis, she felt not just acceptance, but pride radiating from her core. "That's my son," she whispered to the woman beside her. Not every day was filled with music and small miracles. Daniel's autism came with challenges that sometimes felt insurmountable. At 7, he still had meltdowns that could last for hours. The slightest change in routine, a different route to school, a substitute teacher, his favorite crackers being out of stock could trigger a complete emotional shutdown. Sarah learned to read the warning signs, the way his hands would start to flutter more rapidly, how his voice would rise in pitch, the particular way he would rock when overwhelmed. She became an expert at de-escalation, creating calm spaces, and understanding that these weren't tantrums, but neurological storms that Daniel couldn't simply choose to stop. School was an ongoing battle. Despite having an IEP, many teachers still saw Daniel's behaviors as defiance rather than communication. Sarah fought for accommodations, for understanding, for the basic recognition that her son's brilliant mind worked differently than his peers.
"He's disruptive," complained Mrs. Henderson, his second-grade teacher. "The other children can't concentrate when he makes those noises." Sarah took a deep breath, drawing on reserves of patience she didn't know she possessed. Those noises are self-regulation. Without them, Daniel becomes more overwhelmed, not less. Would you prefer he suffer in silence for the comfort of others? The conversation that followed was one of many Sarah would have over the years, educating educators who were supposed to understand neurodiversity but often fell short. Mike and Sarah's marriage didn't survive Daniel's 9th year. The constant stress, the financial strain of therapies and specialists, and their fundamental disagreement about how to support Daniel finally created an unbridgeable gulf between them. "I can't do this anymore," Mike said one evening after Daniel had had a particularly difficult day at school. "I love him, but I don't know how to be his father." Sarah looked at her husband, this man she had loved, had planned a future with, and saw only exhaustion and defeat. "Then don't," she said quietly, "but I won't give up on him. I won't ever give up on him." The divorce was amicable, but heartbreaking. Mike moved to an apartment across town and saw Daniel every other weekend, though the visits were often cut short when Daniel became overwhelmed by the change in environment and routine. As a single mother, Sarah's world contracted and expanded simultaneously. She had less help, less money, less time for herself. But she also had complete autonomy to create the environment Daniel needed to thrive. They developed their own rhythms, their own language. Sarah learned that Daniel's echolalia, his repetition of words and phrases, wasn't meaningless, but deeply communicative. When he repeated red light, green light over and over, he wasn't just stimming. He was processing the social rules of starting and stopping, of waiting and going. She discovered that Daniel's intense interests weren't limitations, but doorways into his remarkable mind. His fascination with weather patterns led to conversations about meteorology that astounded his teachers. His need to organize everything in patterns revealed a mathematical understanding that was years beyond his age level. Adolescence brought new challenges and unexpected gifts. Daniel's body changed faster than his ability to understand those changes, leading to increased anxiety and sensory issues. But his musical abilities continued to evolve in ways that left everyone speechless. At 14,
Daniel composed his first original piece, a haunting melody that captured something ineffable about the experience of being different in a world that demanded conformity. He called it The Space Between, and when he played it for Sarah, she understood immediately what he meant. It's about the space between what people expect and what I am. It's not empty space. It's full of all the things I can't say.
Sarah enrolled him in advanced music theory classes at the local university. The professor, Dr. Rodriguez, was initially skeptical about accepting such a young student, especially one with autism, but after hearing Daniel play, she welcomed him with open arms. "He understands music in a way that transcends typical learning," she told Sarah. "It's as if he's having direct conversations with the composers themselves." Daniel flourished in this environment. The university students accepted his quirks without question, and the structured nature of musical education suited his mind perfectly. For the first time, he had peers who understood his passion, even if they didn't always understand him. High school remained challenging. The social dynamics were incomprehensible to Daniel, and his attempts to connect often resulted in misunderstandings or rejection. But he found refuge in the music room, where Mr. Thompson, the band director, created a safe space for all students to express themselves. "Music doesn't judge," Mr. Thompson told Sarah during a parent conference. "And Daniel's music? It's pure truth. The other kids are starting to hear it too." Daniel's senior year brought a mixture of anxiety and excitement. College applications loomed large, and Sarah worried about how her son would navigate the independence that higher education demanded. They visited several universities with strong music programs. At each campus tour, Sarah watched Daniel carefully, noting how he responded to different environments, different levels of structure and support. Juilliard was intimidating. The level of competition and intensity seemed overwhelming even to Sarah. But when Daniel sat at the piano during his audition and began to play his own composition, The Space Between, something shifted in the room. The panel of judges leaned forward, transfixed by the raw emotion and technical mastery flowing from this young man who rarely made eye contact and stimmed openly when nervous. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in March. Sarah found Daniel in his room, surrounded by his carefully organized collection of sheet music, and handed him the envelope. He opened it with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else, read it twice, then looked up at his mother with wide eyes. "They want me," he said, wonder evident in his voice. "They actually want me?" Sarah gathered her 18-year-old son into her arms, marveling at how tall he'd grown, how his interests had evolved from toy trains to symphonies, how his mind had always been extraordinary, even when the world couldn't see it. "Of course they want you," she whispered into his hair. "You're remarkable." The move to New York City terrified Sarah more than Daniel. He had spent weeks researching the subway system, memorizing routes and schedules with the same intensity he once applied to train timetables. The sensory overwhelm of the city should have been impossible for him, but somehow Daniel found his rhythm among the 8 million strangers. His dorm room became a sanctuary of order amid the chaos of freshman year. His roommate, Marcus, was a jazz bassist from New Orleans who quickly learned to appreciate Daniel's need for routine and quiet space. "He's like a musical savant," Marcus told his girlfriend over FaceTime, not realizing Daniel could hear him. "But also just, I don't know, pure? Like he experiences music in a way the rest of us can only dream about." Daniel's professors were initially concerned about his ability to handle the social and academic pressures of conservatory life. But within weeks, it became clear that while Daniel might struggle with typical peer interactions, his musical intelligence was extraordinary. He developed a reputation for his interpretations of classical pieces. Where other students focused on technical perfection, Daniel found the emotional core of each composition and played from that truthful place. His performances of Chopin's nocturnes left audiences in tears, not because of flashy technique, but because of the pure honesty of his expression. Sarah visited monthly,
taking the train from Columbus to spend weekends in the city that had become Daniel's home. They would walk through Central Park, where the sounds and smells somehow didn't overwhelm him the way they once might have, and he would tell her about his classes, his growing friendships, his dreams of composing a symphony. "I'm thinking about it in 4 movements," he explained during one visit, his hands moving as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. "The first movement is about being different, not sad different, just different. The second is about finding your voice. The third is about connection, how music connects us even when words fail. And the fourth—" He paused, looking across the reservoir where ducks paddled in formation. "What about the fourth?" Sarah prompted gently. "The fourth is about acceptance. Not just other people accepting you, but accepting yourself. All of yourself, even the parts that don't fit." Daniel's sophomore year began with promise. He had been selected for an advanced composition seminar, and his professors spoke of him as a rising star in the classical music world. But by October, Sarah noticed changes during their video calls. He seemed more tired than usual, though he attributed it to increased coursework. His appetite had diminished, concerning for someone who had always been particular about his eating schedule. Most troubling, he had developed a persistent cough that he couldn't seem to shake. "It's just a cold, Mom," he assured her during a call where his voice sounded hoarse and strained. But Sarah's maternal instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She made an appointment with the Student Health Center for Daniel's next visit home during Thanksgiving break. Dr. Patel, their family physician, had known Daniel since he was small. She understood his communication style and was patient with his need to process information slowly. But when she ordered a chest X-ray, her expression grew concerned.
"There are some irregularities," she explained carefully. "I'd like to refer you to a pulmonologist for more tests." The word irregularities sent Sarah's world tilting. After years of fighting for Daniel's right to be different, to be accepted, to thrive, the idea that something might be medically wrong felt like a cruel cosmic joke. The tests came back just before Christmas. Daniel and Sarah sat in Dr. Martinez's office, surrounded by medical degrees and lung diagrams, as she explained the results with the same gentle precision Dr. Chen had used to explain autism all those years ago. "It's a rare genetic condition called lymphangioliomyomatosis, or LAM," she said. "It primarily affects women, but there are rare cases in men, usually associated with tuberous sclerosis complex." The words washed over them like a foreign language. Sarah held Daniel's hand, feeling how calm he seemed compared to her own internal panic. "What does this mean?" she asked, the same question she had posed 18 years earlier in a different doctor's office about a different diagnosis. LAM causes abnormal cell growth in the lungs and lymphatic system. It leads to progressive lung damage and can cause pneumothorax, collapsed lungs. The cough, fatigue, and breathing difficulties Daniel has been experiencing are all consistent with this condition. Daniel, ever logical, asked the question Sarah couldn't voice. "Is it treatable?" Dr. Martinez's pause said everything. "We can manage symptoms and slow progression with certain medications, but LAM it's progressive and ultimately terminal. The timeline varies greatly from patient to patient." The drive home was silent except for the radio playing softly in the background. As they pulled into their driveway, Daniel finally spoke. "I want to finish my symphony," he said simply. The next few months blurred together in a haze of medical appointments, medication adjustments, and Daniel's fierce determination to complete his musical legacy. He withdrew from Juilliard, not out of defeat, but out of practicality. He needed to conserve his energy for what mattered most. Sarah took a leave of absence from her job as a school librarian to care for Daniel full-time. Their house became filled with the sounds of composition, Daniel at the piano, working through melodic themes, calling out to his mother to listen to a particular phrase or harmony.
The fourth movement is the hardest, he told her one afternoon, his breathing more labored than it had been even a month earlier. How do you write music about acceptance when you're still figuring it out yourself? Sarah watched her son, this remarkable young man who had taught her so much about seeing the world differently, and realized that acceptance wasn't a destination, but a daily practice. Maybe, she said carefully, acceptance isn't about being okay with everything. Maybe it's about being present with whatever is true right now. Daniel considered this, his fingers absently playing scales on his thigh. So the music doesn't have to resolve everything, it just has to be honest about where we are. Exactly. By spring, Daniel's condition had progressed significantly, but his determination to share his symphony remained unshaken. The Columbus Symphony Orchestra, learning about his situation through Dr. Rodriguez's connections, offered to perform the completed movements as part of their community outreach concert series. Daniel spent weeks working with the conductor, a patient woman named Maria Santos, who understood that this performance meant everything to him. They met twice weekly, with Daniel teaching her the emotional landscape of each movement, explaining how the autism and LAM had informed different sections of the composition. The second movement has these sudden dynamic changes, he explained, his breath coming in shorter bursts now. That's what it feels like when your neurological system gets overwhelmed, not gradual, but sudden and complete. Maestro Santos listened intently, making notes on her score. And this recurring theme in the strings? That's my mom's voice, Daniel said simply. It appears in every movement because she's been there through everything. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it carries the whole melody, but it's always there. Sarah, who had been listening from the back of the rehearsal hall, felt tears streaming down her cheeks. The performance was scheduled for a Saturday evening in May. Daniel had been hospitalized twice in the past month due to collapsed lungs, but he was determined to attend his symphony's premiere. The concert hall was fuller than anyone had expected. Word had spread through the music community about the young composer with autism whose final work was being performed. Daniel's former professors from Juilliard had driven from New York. Mike, his father, sat awkwardly in the third row, unsure of his place but unable to stay away. Daniel sat in the front row with Sarah, connected to a portable oxygen concentrator that he had named Beethoven in a rare moment of levity. As the lights dimmed, Sarah watched her son's face transform with anticipation and joy. The first movement began with a single clarinet playing a haunting melody. The theme Daniel had called different. As the other instruments joined in, weaving complex harmonies around that original voice, the audience was transported into Daniel's experience of being unique in a world that often demanded conformity. The second movement, Finding Voice, built from tentative musical phrases to bold, confident statements. Sarah could hear Daniel's journey from nonverbal toddler to eloquent composer in every crescendo. The third movement, Connection, was perhaps the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. The way Daniel had written the instruments to communicate with each other, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in counterpoint, but always in relationship, spoke to his deep understanding of how love transcends traditional communication. But it was the fourth movement, Acceptance, that left the entire hall breathless. The music began with the same themes from the earlier movements, but gradually transformed them. What had seemed discordant became beautiful. What appeared broken revealed itself as complete in its own way. The recurring theme that represented Sarah's voice grew stronger throughout the movement, not dominating the other voices, but supporting them, allowing them to shine. In the final measures, all the themes came together, not resolving into traditional harmony, but creating something entirely new, entirely true. As the last note faded into silence, the audience sat in stunned quiet for a moment before erupting into a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Daniel, exhausted but radiant, stood slowly and acknowledged the applause with the same methodical precision he had always applied to everything. Sarah helped him to his feet, and together they faced the crowd. In that moment, she saw not her disabled son or her dying son, but Daniel, complete, perfect, exactly as he was meant to be. The weeks following the symphony's performance were both precious and heartbreaking. Daniel's energy was fading, but his spirit remained luminous. He spent his days listening to recordings of his symphony, making small corrections to the score, and talking with Sarah about everything and nothing. "Do you remember," he said one afternoon as they sat in the garden behind their house, "when I used to line up all my trains?" Sarah smiled. "Hours and hours of perfect organization. I used to worry you'd never play with them the right way." "There is no right way," Daniel said, his voice soft but clear. "I was making sense of the world the only way I knew how. The trains weren't just toys. They were teaching me about order, about patterns, about how things could be beautiful when they were exactly where they belonged." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the sounds of birdsong and distant traffic. "Mom," Daniel said eventually. "Yes, sweetheart." "Thank you for never trying to make me someone else." Sarah reached over and took his hand, marveling at how much these hands had given the world, all the music they had created, all the beauty they had brought into existence. "Thank you for teaching me that there are many ways to be human."
Marcus, his roommate from Juilliard, played Daniel's early composition, The Space Between. Dr. Rodriguez performed one of Daniel's arrangements of Bach. And Sarah, finding strength she didn't know she still possessed, spoke about her son's remarkable life. "Daniel saw the world differently than most of us," she said, looking out at the assembled faces. Teachers who had learned from him, doctors who had cared for him, musicians who had been inspired by him. And because he saw differently, he helped all of us see more clearly. He taught us that being different isn't something to overcome, it's something to celebrate. He showed us that there are many ways to communicate love, many ways to be brilliant, many ways to make the world more beautiful." She paused, her voice strong despite the tears. Daniel's autism wasn't a tragedy to be cured. It was part of what made his music so extraordinary, so honest, so pure. His illness took his life too soon, but his differentness, that was his gift to us all. 6 months after Daniel's death, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. Dr. Rodriguez was organizing a scholarship fund for neurodivergent music students, and she wanted to name it after Daniel. "His symphony is being performed by orchestras across the country," she explained. "There's something about his music that speaks to people in a way that transcends typical performance. It's teaching audiences that different doesn't mean less than, it means uniquely valuable." The Daniel Mitchell Memorial Scholarship would support young musicians with autism, ADHD, and other neurological differences, helping them access the music education that had meant so much to Daniel. Sarah also learned that several of Daniel's former teachers had implemented new approaches in their classrooms, inspired by what they had learned about neurodiversity through knowing him. The ripple effects of his life continued to spread, touching people who had never even met him. On the first anniversary of Daniel's death, Sarah returned to the concert hall where his symphony had premiered. The Columbus Symphony was performing it again, this time as part of their regular season rather than a special community event. The hall was sold out. As she listened to the music her son had created, music that captured the beauty and challenge of being different in a world that often demanded conformity,
Sarah felt the deep truth of acceptance that Daniel had tried to express in that final movement. Love hadn't cured Daniel's autism or prevented his death. But love had seen him, accepted him, and allowed him to flourish exactly as he was. Love had created space for his unique gifts to emerge and share themselves with the world. Love had made his differentness into strength, his challenges into wisdom, his brief life into lasting beauty. As the final notes of acceptance filled the concert hall, Sarah whispered into the darkness, "I see you, Daniel. I've always seen you, and you are perfect, exactly as you were meant to be." The music faded, but the truth it carried, about love, about acceptance, about the many ways of being beautifully human, would continue to resonate in the hearts of everyone who heard it, just as Daniel's extraordinary life would continue to influence everyone who had been privileged to know him.
In the end, Sarah realized this was what acceptance truly meant. Not the absence of grief or challenge, but the presence of love that sees clearly, cherishes completely, and celebrates the unique light that each person brings to the world, however briefly, however differently that light might shine.